situations can only be by grace. And that really applies to Hannah in my mind. She lived in a divided home, a lot of hostility or difficulty in that home, because God was choosing to do something very special in her life. She was initially unable to have children. And in a society, day and time where that meant even more than today, if that's possible, it was a real struggle. And this is similar to some of the wives of earlier patriarchs, Sarah being a classic example, who didn't have children until later in life, because it was a signal that God was going to bless, that when the child finally did arrive, it was kind of a way of God marking that and saying something special is happening here. But things were not easy for her until she had her firstborn. The other wife of her husband, Elkanah, provoked her in many really rough and awful ways. Now, the Bible does not condone polygamy, but it was practiced in the Old Testament. Obviously, different ones of these patriarchs and folks had multiple wives. In the New Testament rules out that practice, but we have to deal with the way where people were at that time. Well, the Bible doesn't condone it. Certainly, that was the situation she was in. And so the other wife, Peninnah, taunted her, and the little digs that were thrown at her, almost with a spiritual superiority. Oh, well, God is blessing me because I'm having children, but you, Hannah, you're not. So there must be something wrong with you, that kind of thing. And we can imagine how hurtful some of those things were. Humiliating. It just shows where pride gets a person. The grace is something that Hannah came to be very familiar with. And in fact, her name can mean favored one or grace, favor. Favor. So it's kind of interesting. God's going to use this one name, favor, to show some favor and something very important that God's going to do through her life. She needed grace to handle her burdens. And against, the King James uses the word adversary to describe Peninnah. Well, isn't that a picture of Jesus? God's grace that comes to help us in the face of our adversary. A real strong picture there. Her arrogant words are similar to the devil, who is always accusing us and those types of things. So there's a lot at work here. The faith is the right response to grace. So when she can't have children, she decides to seek God in this. I think I want to pick up, let's pick up about verse 9 here.
First chapter?
Yes, Samuel chapter 1, verse 9. Once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord. And she made a vow, saying, O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will be used on his head. The Nazarite vow is what she's referring to. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth, she was kind of muttering those words. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, how long will you keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine. Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I've not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I've been praying here out of my anguish and my grief. Eli answered, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. And she said, may your servant find favor in your eyes. And she went away and ate something. Her face was no longer downcast. Early the next morning, they arose, worshipped before the Lord, and went back to their home in Ramah. Elkanah lay with Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. In the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, because I asked the Lord for him. I'm going to stop there for right now. So she responds to her difficulty with faith. She goes looking to God. Now, they travel. They're at Shiloh. They're there to worship the Lord in that place. And while she's there, she just apparently was moved to really pour out her heart at the altar and to just call upon God to move and work in her life. And that is a faith response. A lot of times people, when they are in a situation where they feel like they really want something, things aren't going the way they need them to go or desire strongly for them to go, they can react with bitterness towards God. They can say, oh, God doesn't like me, or I've done something, or and kind of wander off. She doesn't do that. She brings her troubles to God, brings them to the altar, lays them down there. And sometimes when we see obstacles or crisis, we just need to be reminded, bring those things to the Lord, lay them at his feet. But watch also what God does to build faith in her. I mean, this probably was something that she had prayed about before. Certainly a very clear description of what happens on this particular event. God was aware of her need and her desire. It wasn't that she needed to somehow inform him. He was aware of what was going on. He's been using this to build her faith, even to the point of saying, Lord, you give me a son, I'll give him back to you, and literally dedicate her child to the Lord and for his service. So God will mold our faith out of the struggles that we endure. Andre Crouch has a song entitled Through It All. Mm-hmm. And it says that, we can be thankful for the hard times, because if it weren't for the problems, we wouldn't know how God could solve our problems. Mm-hmm. And we wouldn't know what God is able to do. And so Hannah, who does have a song, didn't have that one, but she could have been the author of that song, mm-hmm. Through It All. Someone said her pain helped her understand God with an insight that the spiritual leaders of her day were pitifully unable to communicate. Mm-hmm. She had more spiritual insight, in other words, than religious leaders. Mm-hmm. Eli, being the chief among them, and his two sons, which were acting horribly. Mm-hmm. So Eli observes her in her bitterness and in her agony, and begins to really put her down. Chastise her is a good word for it, yeah. Mm-hmm. Just assuming really the worst. He sees her praying. She's not praying out loud verbally, but her lips are moving as if, and people do that sometimes, and he just assumes the worst. Well, she must be drunk. I mean, after all, you come down here to church and you get drunk. I mean, what's going on with this? And accuses her. Put your wine away. Come on. And she's like, and yes, she responds to him with humility and appropriateness. Mm. Not so, my Lord. I'm a woman who's deeply troubled. I've not been drinking. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. There's another place she used that same phrase. Verse 18. May your servant find favor in your eyes. Again, she's very respectful of him, even though he had not been respectful of her. So she does a good job there. And she demonstrates her faith. She is never bitter in all of this.
Wow.
Compare that with Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, who on one occasion, after losing her husband, said, "Don't call me Naomi,
Yeah.
call me Mara," which means bitter, because the Lord has made my life very bitter. She wanted her name to be changed to reveal, Naomi did, how bitter she was with her circumstances. I went away full, meaning she went off to to Moab, married. The Lord brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Lord has brought misfortune upon me. She had a pretty good pity party there. Job's wife, curse God and die. The Israelites, during the period called book Lamentations, they're kind of, bitterness. Oh, we're weeping. Oh, this bad stuff's happened to us. Yeah, we brought it on ourselves. They didn't say. But Hannah was generous. She was responsible. She was humble. She was kind. Even as badly as she hurts, and I mean, she says it. She's, talks about being in great anguish and grief, being downhearted and just broken hearted in so many different ways. She doesn't let it make her bitter. And really studying this again, it's been a while since I looked at this passage. That really just stood out to me. So she had a tremendous faith that was going on in her life. And responding out of that with some obedience. She dedicated her son out of devotion. And in verse 21, when the man Elkanah went up with all his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, "After the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always." And then the next couple verses to say, well, man, that's what happened. And so verse 24, after he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, a skin of wine, and brought them before the house of the Lord at Shiloh. And when they had slaughtered the bull and brought the boy to Eli, she said to him, "As surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child. The Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." And he worshiped the Lord there. What she pledged, she did. She followed through on that. I can't imagine it was easy. Come back regularly to see him, perhaps with some regularity, but to have to give him up. And the Lord blessed her later on with other children as well. So God really came through for her. She dedicated. I think she had to be a little bit aware that God wanted to do something special in her life. She was not bargaining with God for an answer. Do we ever do that in prayer? Lord, if you, I'll. No, she wasn't doing that. She meant it, and she carried out with it. And she did, in a very literal sense, what every Christian parent should do by dedicating her child to God and trusting him, trusting that child to God's care. So she had, her name means grace. And in the end, she experienced much grace from God in that, Samuel rose to be a great leader, a spiritual leader in Israel. She had other children. She had what she desired and received it from the Lord. She demonstrated her faith in God. Part of that was not becoming bitter. Part of that was following through on what she pledged to do. She followed through. There was an obedience there as well to God. She didn't make a rash commitment, like the guy who said, "Oh Lord, the first thing I see come out of my house when I come home, I'll sacrifice it to you." Oh, wrong thing to say. This was a very thoughtful and very legitimate thing, and her faith produced obedience. Her trust produced joy, and she saw the results of those things. And she did continue to take care of Samuel. She would take things up to Shiloh for him. I mean, she didn't just dump him off somewhere, but I mean, he definitely was there in the Lord's service. There's so much more Lord willing, maybe we'll have some chance to go through and see what it is that the Lord used Samuel for. This is the beginning. And it started with a woman who refused to be bitter because of her bad circumstances and lived a life of faith. And I think a lot to learn from her. And on Mother's Day, she is one that we can look to as a biblical example for all of us. And with that, I would ask if you have any prayer requests. I know we want to pray for Dee. We want to pray for Donna.